Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Emily Wongan. I'm a 3L in the JDMA program at the College of Law and Haub School of ENR, and I am an article editor for this year's Law Review Board. So today's panel explores how law, litigation, and storytelling shape the enforcement and evolution of the Endangered Species Act. We'll begin with two presentations, first from Professor Heather Elliott, and then from Dean Temple Stoellinger, followed by a moderated Q&A panel and audience discussion. Let's get started. Our first panelist joins us from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where I am sure it is much warmer than it is right now, with significantly less snow. Heather Elliott is the John J. Sparkman Chair of Law at the University of Alabama, where she currently teaches civil procedure, land use law, and water law. Her scholarship focuses on the role of courts and agencies in a democratic society, as well as Alabama water law and policy. Professor Elliott is a former law clerk to U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and to Judge Merrick Garland of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. She has also worked in private practice in Washington, D.C. on cases involving constitutional law, Indian law, administrative law, and environmental law. Her forthcoming article in the Wyoming Law Review blends literary analysis with legal commentary, using Joe Pickett as a lens for exploring the moral and cultural dimensions of environmental law, and making a compelling case for why we need more public servants like Joe Pickett. We are very fortunate to have Professor Elliott with us. Please give her a warm welcome.
Okay, is this on? Yeah, great. This is my first time in the beautiful state of Wyoming, and so I'm really grateful to the law school, Dean Hill, the Law Review, and everyone involved in making this such a wonderful event for the opportunity to be here. And I want to especially thank C.J. Box for creating Joe Pickett and a series that's one of my favorite in all literature. As you'll see, I took a different approach to the ESA subject than we might have expected. I took the opportunity to write about the first Joe Pickett book, Open Season, in a different way. So bear with me for what will seem like a deviation from our topic, but I promise I'm heading toward the Endangered Species Act. So we live in polarized times. Many people make assumptions about those that they perceive as being on the other side. But Joe Pickett doesn't do this. People have no sides until he gets to know them better. He would treat me, for example, as a whole person, not a stereotype. And he would learn that despite my education and time on the coast, which presumably make me a member of the coastal elite, I, contrary to expectations, have a well-used by me Ford F-150. I can do plumbing, carpentry, and electrical work. I can rebuild an engine so long as it's carbureted and not fuel injected. And I like to shoot guns at the gun range. Just as law schools are said to provide an antidote to these polarized times by modeling how to disagree without being disagreeable, so too do Joe Pickett and his family, Mary Beth, Sheridan, April, and Lucy. Throughout the books, Joe is open to the humanity of everyone he meets, and he takes reasonable and moderate positions on almost every issue he faces. That includes the Endangered Species Act. See, I told you I'd get there. In Open Season, Joe is faced with the difficulties that his hometown, Saddle String, will encounter if endangered species are found in the area, limits on hunting, jobs lost when timber cannot be felled, and the like. At the same time, he is both outraged and heartbroken when he finds the destruction that evil men have wrought on the Miller's weasels, a species thought lost to extinction, then found only, it seems, to be extirpated again. And in his anger and heartbreak, Joe's like most Americans, supermajorities of whom support the preservation of endangered species and find something very wrong with man's destruction of what God has wrought. Open Season, though, also highlights how the very strength of the Endangered Species Act both undermines the achievement of its goals and plants the seeds of its own destruction. Governor Rulon points out in a later book that it's a poor law that encourages its own violation. Open Season highlights the phenomenon of shoot, shovel, and shut up, where a landowner kills and buries any member of an endangered species found on her land in order to avoid the limitations the act would place on the land if the presence of the species were known. Unbelievably, one of my students was actually told by his agriculture professor at a large land-grant institution in class that shoot, shovel, shut up is the right approach for dealing with endangered species. This directly undermines the achievement of the ESA's goals. The strength of the ESA has also led to repeated efforts to amend or abolish it. The current administration has pending a proposed rule that would remove habitat modification from the definition of harm under the Act. Under that rule, no private development activity, no matter how harmful to an endangered or threatened species, would be stopped by the strictures of the Act. And the panel just before, the game wardens highlighted other problems that the ESA has in generating litigation and diverting attention away from perhaps attention to the species themselves. So a better solution might be to have an understanding that both sides have legitimate concerns and laudable goals. My students are often surprised, knowing as they do that I'm a pretty lefty person. They're often surprised to hear that I believe landowners should be compensated when their land is significantly restricted by the ESA. I believe this both because it is more fair to private property owners and also because it is more likely to result in the preservation of species, preventing at least some instances, I would hope, of shoot, shovel, and shut up. By the same token, however, it is too easy to discount the benefits of the Act in protecting the wilderness that the game wardens told us was so necessary for future generations, providing protection of habitat, which provide habitat that provides the resulting environmental services that Professor Kalin talked about this morning that we get from wilderness. So it is this kind of open-hearted and open-minded collaboration that can better achieve the goals of the Act and, if writ large, can also help overcome today's polarized politics. Mary Beth says at one point that Joe, as a decent and honorable man, is virtually an endangered species himself. I hope that isn't true. We should all aspire to be like Joe Pickett. We should all aspire to consider the humanity of others. We need more Picketts. And by the way, spoiler alert, Joe and Sheridan do actually save the Miller's weasel. So.
Thank you for that presentation, Professor Elliott. Our next panelist is Dean Temple Stoellinger. She is the Associate Dean at the Haub School of Environment and Natural Resources and Associate Professor at the College of Law at the University of Wyoming. She also co-directs the Gina Center for Land and Water Law and coordinates the JDMA program in ENR. Her scholarship is focused on decision-making around land, energy, and wildlife, and she brings deep expertise in NEPA, ESA, and public lands law. Her forthcoming article explores the legal, ecological, and cultural complexities surrounding grizzly bear recovery and delisting under the Endangered Species Act. Using C.J. Box's novel, 3-Inch Teeth, as a narrative lens, she examines how apex predators like grizzlies, who were once endangered, now expanding beyond recovery zones, challenge existing legal frameworks and public expectations. Please welcome Dean Stoellinger.
Thank you. And I just wanted to note that my colleague in the Haub School, Professor Kelly Dunning, was going to join us here today, but her kids have norovirus, so I'm pretty glad to not be sitting next to her up on this panel. But I did want to say I cut her part of the slides out because it's too technical for me based on her expertise. So I'm just going to talk about sort of the legal structure of delisting grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And as Emily mentioned, we cover that from Mr. Box's 3-Inch Teeth. And as Ryan explained earlier, this book opens with a grizzly bear emerging from the trees in the Wyoming Bighorn Mountains to kill a fisherman, crushing his skull in what appears to be a predatory attack. The narrative attention derives not from the biological impossibility, but from the geographic implausibility. It occurs in a territory that grizzly bears had not previously occupied in modern history. I understand that Mr. Box, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, drew his inspiration from a 2018 incident in the Terrace Mountain area in Teton County, where a sow grizzly and her yearling fatally mauled a hunting guide. Wyoming Game and Fish officials describe the behavior as unusually aggressive, exhibiting predatory characteristics rather than defensive behavior. Box's fictional scenario reflects a fundamental challenge that we address in our paper. Grizzly bears have recovered so successfully that they now roam beyond their designated recovery zones, yet federal delisting efforts have repeatedly failed. Caught between contested science and competing narratives about connectivity requirements, federal authority, local control, and coexistence with apex predators. What we wanted to understand is, why does conservation success keep producing legal failure? Might help if I turn it on. All right, there we go. That's the first slide, actually. So understanding this question requires some historical context. In the 1850s, an estimated 50,000 grizzly bears inhabited 18 western lower 48 states. Government-funded eradication programs reduced the population to only 500 to 800 individuals by 1975, when they were listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, occupying just 2% of their historic range. But conservation responses have been remarkably successful. Today, nearly 2,000 grizzly bears inhabit the lower 48, with over 1,000 in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem alone. Yet, translating biological success into legal delisting has proven to be extraordinarily difficult. The federal government has attempted to delist the GYE population of grizzly bears twice, and both attempts have been overturned. In 2007, the Fish and Wildlife Service delisted the Yellowstone grizzly, but the Ninth Circuit vacated that rule, finding that the service failed to properly analyze white bark pine decline, thought to be a key food source for the grizzly bears. After a decade of additional study, the service tried again in 2017, but Montana Federal District Court Judge Christensen found the service had engaged in real-time balkanization, carving up the population to enable delisting without analyzing effects on remnant populations. Critically, the service had an insufficient connectivity plan, contradicting, in his opinion, the best available science. When the Ninth Circuit reviewed this case in 2020, they established 3 binding precedents for the future delisting. Examine remnant populations, ensure states adopt enforcement mechanisms for long-term genetic health, and commit to recalibrating population metrics if estimate methods change. These requirements, however, created what we call the connectivity paradox. Courts now require connectivity between grizzly bear populations as a prerequisite for delisting, demonstrating genetic exchange and evidence of long-term viability. But the ESA's distinct population segment that Rick talked about earlier requires that DPS populations be significant and distinct. And distinct means that they're marketably separate from other populations. Do you see the contradiction? As grizzly bear populations expand and connectivity increases, precisely what the courts have required, their discreteness disappears. The more connected bears become through conservation success, the less discrete they are for legal purposes. And the result? Connectivity becomes both essential for conservation and a barrier for delisting. Recovery success, therefore, undermines legal categories designed to recognize success. This paradox became a critical part of the January 2025 decision issued at the tail end of the Biden administration. And in that decision, the Fish and Wildlife Service declined to delist the greater Yellowstone ecosystem distinct population segment and the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem population as well, finding insufficient distinctness due to increased connectivity. Instead, the service proposed a unified lower 48 grizzly bear DPS, as you can see on this map, managed under a revised 4D rule that is still pending. So this abandons the population by population framework that was promised in 1993, creating an all or nothing system. However, the Trump administration could revise this approach, and it's under current review. So when C.J. Box wrote about grizzly bears appearing where they weren't supposed to be, he wasn't just creating fictional drama, he was capturing a real governance challenge. And in my opinion, the grizzly bear has done what the ESA asked. It's been recovered from the brink, and the question now is whether our legal system can evolve as successfully as the species they were designed to protect. Thank you, Emily. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much to both of our presenters for those insightful and thought-provoking comments. We're now going to move into a moderated Q&A where I'll pose a few questions to connect themes across both papers, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So my first question is, C.J. Box's novels often dive into complex legal issues, whether it's wildlife conservation, land use, and especially the Endangered Species Act. To start us off, how do you think media, whether fiction like Joe Pickett or other nonfiction media, shapes public understanding of the ESA? And what does it get right, and where do you think it falls short?
I don't know that I could speak to the media as a whole. I do know that a recent study showed that 86% of Americans generally support the goals of the ESA, and so I'm not sure whether that's because of organizations focus on what they call charismatic megafauna, right, which are the large animals that are very cute or striking looking. I'm also not sure whether the authors of the study presented any data on how recovery of species occurs and the controversies that can arise around different plans. I know in Alabama, one of the issues we have is that so many of the extinctions occurred before the Endangered Species Act existed that we've just lost a lot of the biodiversity before we even had a chance to protect it. It's estimated that the first Alabama power dam on the Coosa River was the 4th largest extinction event ever in North America. That's from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and that's because Alabama has very unusual geology that leads to really extreme speciation, and so lots of species in very, very narrow ecological niches, all of which were drowned by the dam. And so I think, I don't know where I'm going with this except to say that I think the needs of species around the country they're very different and face very different problems. It's really different to be dealing with incredible aquatic biodiversity, which is what we have in Alabama, versus the resurgence of a large predator that poses a lot of danger to humans at the human-wilderness interface. And so I guess to the extent that the media sort of covers it all as a uniform block, that would not be a very helpful approach.
Great. I wish Kelly was here because her research lab has done a really interesting report where they actually analyzed every single piece of media on grizzly bears over a 15-year period of time and coded all of it. And what they found through their result was that actually the conversations that are dominating the narrative discussion about grizzly bears are politicians and legal advocates. So it's not the managers and it's not the scientists that are talking about recovery. It's become politicized, right? And it's what Governor Freudenthal used to call the 100%ers that are dominating the conversation. And that creates a really difficult space for managers to move forward with, common sense policy that most people are going to understand and accept. And so I think it's put Game and Fish in a tough position. I think it's put the Fish and Wildlife Service in a tough position. And we get into that a little bit in our article, so I hope everybody reads it when it gets published. But we talk about what we call sort of the shadow narratives that have really boxed in the policy path forward for delisting grizzly bears.
Thank you for those responses. My next question is more geared toward Temple, but please jump in if you have anything to add. Temple, your article explores the legal and political efforts to delist grizzly bears in the lower 48. Can you share examples of successful ESA protections or management cases and what lessons those might offer to grizzly bear delisting efforts?
I can, and I did want to also say, I didn't include this in my presentation, but I think there's a path forward for grizzly bears even under the 2025 rule that was released, and that's through a little-known provision of the Endangered Species Act called Section 4D, and that allows for some creative management of species. And so under 4D, we've successfully recovered and created some flexible management regimes for a variety of different types of species. But the Gila trout comes to mind. And under the Gila trout in New Mexico 4D example, you could actually fish sections of the Gila River where the Gila trout were recovered. And then you couldn't fish other sections of the river where recovery hadn't been established. So I think, an approach like that could work for grizzly bears as well. Maybe we can come up with a 4D rule that allows for, maybe sort of state management authority, novel idea, of a recovered grizzly bear population in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, or maybe even in the northern continental divide system. So I think looking to 4D and some of the successful examples we've seen as it's been applied to species like Gila trout would be my answer.
I guess I would just add that another species that comes up repeatedly in the novels that has recovered largely is the gray wolf. And there have been a lot of controversies around its delisting here in the Mountain West, and then there's a proposed, I think the Biden administration then delisted it in the entire lower 48, but that was suspended by a court. And then the current Congress is proposing amending the Endangered Species Act to say that the gray wolf could never be listed again, is my understanding. And so I think one thing that's happened in the areas where the wolf has been delisted is that there then have been a lot of hunting events where the wolves have been killed. And so I'm kind of interested to see whether with grizzlies and with wolves that you end up with this kind of teetering back and forth across recovery versus now back into threatened status versus recovery. And I don't know how likely that is because I don't live in a state where we have those issues, but I'd be curious to know what Temple knows about that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think once you delist a species, it's probably very politically hard to relist the species, just from sort of a human dimensions and a political standpoint. But I agree, states can maybe manage a little too aggressively, particularly after there's some pent-up frustration after a species being listed for a long period of time. And I hope we see kind of a balancing of that, particularly on the Montana side of the wolf situation. But yeah, so I guess that's my response. Yeah.
Great. My next question is more geared toward Heather, but once again, Temple, please jump in if you have a response. Heather, your article highlights Joe Pickett's deep respect for the law and his moral compass, especially when enforcing wildlife laws. Based on your reading of the novels and your own legal perspective, what do you think Joe Pickett's approach reveals about how the Endangered Species Act should be enforced?
Well, I think he would probably agree with what Rick said in the previous panel, that there are some perverse incentives created by the act itself. I think in open season, there's just a very moving scene where he finds a shoot, shovel, and shut up at a very large scale. And the way he thinks about that event, to me, really highlights the underlying largeness that's behind the Endangered Species Act. And so I think the best example I can give is a metaphor, an analogy that I use in the paper, which is the text I used to teach environmental law has an example of a scientist who wants to find the oldest creature on Earth and ends up deciding that the bristlecone pine is probably the oldest creature on Earth and wants to know how old the bristlecone pine is, and this is before modern micro-coring technology, and so he cuts it down to count the rings and finds out that it's 4,300 something years old. And the textbook goes on to say, did you feel a little hollow in the pit of your stomach on reading that? Because who are we to cut down the oldest species, the oldest creature on the planet? And I think some of what Joe's responses to the treatment of the Miller's weasels in open season has an echo of that. Who are we to intentionally just decide to extinguish a species? At the same time, the books throughout are sort of alive to the costs of to landowners and to communities of the restrictions that the act imposes. I agree with Rick from the previous session that there has sort of arisen this kind of business of pursuing Endangered Species Act claims, and I think they have a real risk of breaking the act. A nonprofit group brought a petition for the listing of over 400 species in Alabama alone about 15 years ago, and that magnitude of listing is going to break the Fish and Wildlife Service, right? They can't list that many species that quickly, and then they're going to get sued for not listing the species that the petition was written for. And so to bring it back to Joe, I think he would, on the one hand, very much want to protect endangered species and protect wilderness, but I think he would want to do it in a way that on the ground had sort of more moderation and sense to it.
What are some of the most significant ESA-related conflicts that are currently unfolding, and what might lie ahead in those conflicts?
Well, that's a good question. Well, I don't know. I sit in Wyoming, so I think the grizzly bear one is a pretty big one. Obviously, our neighbors to the south have reintroduced gray wolves under an experimental population, and there's definitely conflict at the border about wolves as well. So I think I don't know. I think I'm biased, but I think carnivores present a particular challenge under the Endangered Species Act. And, I always thought that if Congress has to step in and address an Endangered Species Act problem, does that mean that the Endangered Species Act failed and that it's broken and it needs revised? And actually, the Fish and Wildlife Service employee told me that wasn't his perspective at all, that that's a relief valve that's available under our process of government. And so, maybe Congress needs to get involved like it did with gray wolves when addressing predators, because there's so many 100%ers on both sides of this issue, and we've really created these political shadow narratives that really make it hard to move forward.
I also think there's a great quote from the senator from Alaska, whose name I'm blanking on, the very conservative Don Young, who voted for the Endangered Species Act when it was enacted in the early 70s, but later in an interview said, we weren't thinking about all these mussels and species of ferns. We were thinking about pigeons, by which he meant the passenger pigeon, of course, which had been extinguished earlier in the century. And when you look at the scope of endangerment now, the Fish and Wildlife Service, I think it's about 1,400 something species total listed, but the International Union for the Conservation of Nature lists 45,000 species that they believe are threatened. And the recent report from the International Panel on Biodiversity and Environmental Ecosystem Services says that it thinks that over 1 million species are at risk of extinction from climate change, and notes that something like 50% of species are either moving up in elevation or moving toward the poles to escape warmer temperatures. And when you think about that sort of almost unimaginable scope of activity, it kind of makes it hard to imagine how the Endangered Species Act could ever deal with it. And so I think in some ways, I don't know, I just sort of, I sort of feel like almost like it's angels dancing on the head of a pin at this point, because ecosystems are at such risk. And it's hard to imagine what Fish and Wildlife could do, even if they had all the power in the world.
Yeah, Heather, what you were just saying reminded me of the fact that the goal of the Endangered Species Act is to conserve species before they go extinct and the habitats upon which they depend. But the goal of the act doesn't ever actually say anything about recovery. And the Fish and Wildlife Service has been really chronically underfunded to be able to achieve the goal of recovery. Recovery takes a lot of time and takes a lot of money. And thinking about species conservation at a state level is the same, right? Game and Fish is funded on the backs of the licenses bought by men and women that like to hunt and like to fish. And so I think, looking honestly about the necessary budget it's going to take to be able to consider conservation for not just big game and species that we hunt and fish, but also, smaller animals as well. And so I forgot the name of the statute when I was talking last night, but it's the Recovery of American Wildlife Act that's been kind of debated back and forth in Congress several times. But I just really feel like that kind of investment at the federal level to help support states and tribes with a needed injection of some federal funding to help them achieve conservation success at the state and local and tribal level is going to be really critical to address that. Those angels dancing on the tip of the pin.
Kind of going off of what you both said in my last question, what reform efforts have been proposed to improve the ESA, and why have some succeeded while others have stalled?
Well, the sort of two famous reforms were in the wake of the snail darter case, TVA versus Hill. Congress amended the Endangered Species Act to create the Endangered Species Committee, which is an entity composed of the heads of several federal agencies plus a representative from the affected state who can vote by a supermajority to allow the extinction of a species, even if otherwise it would be protected under the jeopardy provision of the Act, which applies to projects that are have federal funding or federal permits or conducted by agencies themselves. That entity has only ever voted twice to authorize the extinction of a species, and in neither case did it go forward to cause the extinction of the species. But the current administration has called for that committee to meet at least quarterly to see whether there should be more exemptions granted. The other big amendment was to create the Habitat Conservation Plan and Incidental Take Permit program, which if you're a developer who wants to develop land and you're afraid that you may take species incidentally through your development activities, you can file a habitat conservation plan, which if Fish and Wildlife or the National Marine Fisheries Service finds meets the requirements of the Act, and you pursue the plan you have created to conserve the habitat while you engage in your development activities, you get what's called an incidental take permit, which means if you incidentally harm a member of the species, you are not subject to the penalties of the Act. And so those are two sort of safety valves that have, come in through congressional action. More broadly, I think there have been proposals that have not passed to, for example, take out the habitat modification definition of harm. Right now, as I mentioned, the current administration has a pending proposed rule that would change the Fish and Wildlife regulation that defines the word harm in Section 10, which is the take provision, to include habitat modification that actually kills or endangered wildlife by affecting essential breeding and feeding activities. That's not quite verbatim, but pretty close. And if that's removed from the Act, that means the only thing that would be covered by the take provision are not incidental takes where they're a byproduct of other activities like windmills that kill birds, as Nate Romanowski is very upset about in one of the books, or power lines that kill birds, or a development that destroys habitat for a particular mammal. The only thing that would be covered by the take provision are intentional efforts to kill, harm, harass, hunt endangered species. And that's a dramatic narrowing of what would be covered by the Act. And the current proposal would be a regulatory change, which could in turn be reversed by a subsequent administration. But if Congress amends the Act to say we do not mean for harm to include habitat modification, then that would be a much more difficult thing to reverse.
Yeah, I'm just going to piggyback on what Rick said earlier, and I mean, I'm going to go to regulatory reform first before thinking about statutory reform. But this idea of the distinct population segment definition maybe being revised to only address the distinctness part being revised to only address to when you're listing a species, but not when you're delisting a species, because it has created this connectivity paradox. So that's a thought about reform. And then I think your point too, Rick, about limiting judicial reform in some ways, whether that's curtailing attorneys' fees or, maybe looking at some statutory amendments to address also, this sort of bulk of litigation that's filed at the Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service is in a response to a situation to have to respond to quickly with very limited resources. And wouldn't it be better to put some of those resources on the ground towards conservation? So those are my thoughts. But maybe to answer your bigger question, Emily, why do some amendments or proposals succeed and others don't? I think, back to Heather's earlier points, the Endangered Species Act overall remains a very popular statute if you were to poll Americans nationwide. And, we have to remember that there's people in New York City that really love the idea of wolves and grizzly bears being on the landscape here. And so I think that's what makes it so difficult to change is its popularity and the fact that Americans have a lot of passion for wildlife and want to see them conserved.
And just to point something that I thought was a very interesting finding by this 2025 study is that there is no urban-rural divide on support for the Endangered Species Act. We often think that it's people in New York who want to be able to go out and see the charismatic megafauna, and they're the ones imposing their will on people in the rural areas. But this study, which appeared to me to be conducted in a reliable scientific way, showed that there was no divide by partisan affiliation and no divide based on urban versus rural residents. in who supported the act. And I thought that was astonishing, especially given today's polarized politics. And the shadow narrative that this is the coastal elites imposing their will on the heartland.
I have one final question before we move into audience Q&A. So those of you in the audience be thinking of some questions. Otherwise, if you scan the QR code, you can get our Slido link and submit them that way. But my final question is, what is one thing that you wish the public or policymakers better understood about the ESA? And how can we communicate those things to them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm going to go back to what was the actual purpose that's listed in the statute. It's to, prevent extinction. I think the public gets really frustrated by the slow pace of recovery and delisting species. But I don't think the public understands that's not the way the act was written. It was written to really prevent extinction. It wasn't written to ensure recovery. And again, that I wish the public also knew the limited budgets that both federal, state, and local wildlife managers are dealing with to conserve wildlife.
I think two things. One is that there was another study that came out recently that tried to estimate the number of species that have been saved by the act, not because they've been listed, but because they never became endangered in the first place because of the operation of the act on the endangered and threatened species, right? Because if you list for example, if you list a charismatic megafauna and you protect its habitat, you're protecting everything under it, right? You're protecting the smaller animals, the plants, and so the estimate was that the act had saved, I'm not going to remember the number now, but that the act had been very, very successful and I think prevented something like 95% of the extinctions that might have otherwise happened. And that would be useful for people to know. I also think that it would be useful for people to know I'm sorry, my brain is cramped. I think somebody told me, it's the altitude, yes. That's what the game wardens told me during lunch, is that my brain is not working because of the altitude. I think people don't understand that many of the species that are listed are not the charismatic megafauna, right? So in Alabama, by far the highest number of species that are listed are mussels, right? We have just inordinate different species of mussels. We have inordinate different species of crayfish and fish. And protecting them ends up protecting watersheds, ends up protecting flow of water for recreation and navigation, ends up protecting all kinds of other benefits that we get from wetlands, from habitat. And I think ecosystem services is something that would make sense to people if we were able to get it out there in the media more, that we actually get billions and billions of dollars every year in benefits provided to us by nature, by the filtering that wetlands do, by the processing of decomposition by insects and bacteria. And when we don't take into account those values, then we have a hard time persuading people on the ground, like, here's why it's a good idea to take these actions to preserve this species.
Thank you both for your responses. I guess we've got a little time before we move into audience Q&A. So do you have any final parting thoughts about CJ Box and the ESA and what we've discussed today?
Well, I just wanted to thank CJ. I particularly appreciated in the first novel how you included snippets of the Endangered Species Act. The public probably never had a chance to actually read the act or won't in their ordinary life come across it. So thanks for actually putting the law into your book.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate what I said in my talk more generally, which is that I'm just really grateful for a character in the book who is such a good person, who tries to do his best, doesn't always succeed, sometimes, occasionally has done very bad things. But I find the books a great antidote to a lot of what is prominent in the media today about our lives, and I want to thank Mr. Box for that.
Well, thank you both. Yeah, please give a round of applause. So we've got a lot of great questions from online, so thank you all for that. How might our approach to the ESA in the U.S. be improved by biodiversity protection laws, policies, and practices in other countries?
Oh, I can take a crack at that because we just hosted an international wildlife conference 2 weeks ago in Jackson, where we brought in people from 5 of the 7 continents to explore similar wildlife challenges that we have in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in international context. And it's amazing how many of the same similar challenges that we're facing in different parts of the world. I think Europe is a really interesting case study, particularly around wolves. They just downlisted wolves under both the Berne Convention and the Habitats Directive in Europe, and so now they're working towards individual country-by-country management strategies that will probably include some management tools. So I think, picking our heads up every once in a while to see how other parts of the world are managing wildlife is a helpful exercise. And so that was an interesting parallel to draw with regards to wolves in particular.
I don't know anything specific about international biodiversity law, but I do know that I have learned a lot from international approaches to water management, both surface water and groundwater. The EU in particular has had some really successful approaches to groundwater management, and so I have to think that we just have lots to learn from looking at what other countries do in any field.
Great, thank you. A related question, wonder if it came from the same person. What types of cultural changes in the U.S. do you think would be beneficial to help facilitate greater biodiversity protection and better implementation of the ESA?
That's a tough one. I've talked to several friends that are attorneys in the state of Wyoming, and they go to a lot of public hearings right now to talk about proposed projects, and they report back that a town hall meeting is a pretty rough place to be right now about not feeling particularly safe in conversations in communities as we talk about tough issues, including wildlife conservation and new energy development. So I think we're at a really kind of a scary time right now where people are really mad about a lot of things. And so I think, reminding everybody, as you were mentioning, that we share a lot of common values around wildlife. We all kind of want to see the same thing, which are wildlife thriving on the landscape. We may differ about how those wildlife are ultimately managed, but I think there's a lot of room right now for conversation about things that we share. We share that value for wildlife conservation.
Yeah. One of the things I find interesting in the books is the way hunting is portrayed, because Joe is always helping his neighbors who need to get their elk, and supports hunters who are ethical and field dress their meat and then take it home and freeze it for the year. And he hates poachers and trophy hunters. And if you look at a recent study done about hunting, that basically mirrors what most Americans think. Most Americans think that it's perfectly fine for people to hunt, or super majorities of Americans are in support of people hunting to get meat or to protect their families. But as you start to get into, I'm hunting for the challenge of it, or I'm hunting for a trophy, the numbers just plummet. And I think that's something, again, I think we agree on a lot more things than we realize, because so much of what's covered in the media are the extremes and the people who are the loudest. And I kind of hope that Joe sort of represents this silent majority that we just need to figure out how to get them to start talking.
All right, does anyone else in the audience have any questions?
As a former backcountry guide in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem near Cody, I've got a lot of anecdotal stories about the big bear. And you would probably think that I am a strong advocate for delisting. I'm neutral. I know that when I guided, all I wanted was the big bears to respect me as much as I respected them. And that wasn't the case when I was in that country. And it's still not the case. I've got 2 friends that have had horrific encounters with bears. I was fortunate to avoid that type of situation. In any event, my direct question is to Temple and to Heather as well. How do you view the potential for the delisting of the grizzly bear in the future?
Well, I think Brian Neswick was appointed for a reason. Brian Neswick is the former director of the Wyoming Game and Fish and has, pretty strong opinions about delisting grizzly bears, and he's been appointed the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. So, I know that's top of his agenda. I just don't know if you can get around this judicial precedent that's been set in the Ninth Circuit. So, it may be a situation where he has to deal with this mega lower 48 population, but get really creative with the 4D rule. And as I said, you could do some really interesting things with the 4D rule. You could essentially treat the greater Yellowstone ecosystem like a recovered population and allow for management like it's a recovered population while maybe conserving other distinct population segments or other areas of bears with more prescriptive management. So I don't know if I had to look into my crystal ball, I sort of think that's where we're heading, but I also at the same time feel like I bet Brian's going to try pretty hard to see if he could do something with that mega lower 48 DPS designation.
And I should clarify, I love those big bears. If there's one indicator of wilderness, it's the grizzly bear. And you can, without a doubt, if you see a grizzly bear, you know you're in wilderness. So I love and respect the bears.
Yeah.
I just want them to respect me. That's the only thing.
I appreciate that. And, we've, the Haub School, we have some colleagues who have done studies of people who come to visit Yellowstone. And it used to be that everybody came to Yellowstone to see the geothermal features, and that's shifted. So the majority of visitors come to Yellowstone and Grand Teton to see wildlife. And so, I think we have to be careful, to your point, about if we delist, our state's being a little too aggressive with management to make sure that, we're still keeping that in mind as well.
I don't really have anything.
Looks like we've got a question in the back.
In listening in light of your discussions about how difficult it is to delist, for example, the bears, but also to your colleague's point about, and you mentioned as well, if you delist them, it might be too aggressive with management, and then you have something that is below the desired levels, and how difficult it is to get them back on an endangered species list. Is there discussion from scholars or those that are trying to work on the best plan to talk about, and I don't know the right phraseology, but selective management? For example, when you have a population that's exploding and it is causing the difficulty with encounters of people versus apex predators, to do a focused population reduction without having to go as far as delisting them or facing the battles you're facing on those wide scales. And if those efforts are there, how effective have they been?
Yeah, did Martin leave? Martin's probably the best person to answer that question. But, I think the answer to your question is yes. You can do, a lot of management strategies. The Game and Fish could do a lot of interesting management strategies to address those types of population dynamics. So I don't know if you have anything else to add, but if you see Martin in the hallway, ask Martin that question, because I bet he's got a great response.
All right, we've got a question up front here.
Actually, two different questions, I guess. First would be, there's no divide in support of the ESA. Do we see any divide in the implementation of the ESA across geographic regions or rural, urban divides?
Well, I think you probably know that study you're referencing better than I do, but I can speak to it from just looking at what happened in Colorado, and there's been some really interesting studies. I think most people in the room know, but the Colorado voters actually voted to reintroduce wolves into Colorado. And so there have been analysis after the fact of that vote, and it was pretty much on a party line, with Democrats voting for wolf reintroduction and Republicans voting against. But it also sort of followed the geographic lines of the state, which with the Front Range voting for wolf reintroduction and the people in the rural part of Colorado that were going to have to deal with the wolves voting against it. And so I think that's maybe even a state specific example of how that divide can happen between urban and rural and different parties.
The follow-up question kind of off of that is there any regulation or statutory changes that y'all would like to see implemented to keep the ESA from being used politically, have it actually stick to its function of protecting wildlife?
I don't know that you can ever prevent any statute from being used politically. I think the recommendation to try to shift resources from litigation over the act to actual implementation of the act would be helpful. I did want to say something in response to your first question, which is, the problem we have in Alabama is that we don't like regulators. And, I mean, I know that...
We don't like them here either.
Yeah, exactly. So I've been trying to get a pretty basic water management statute enacted in Alabama for 15 years now. And I've literally been at meetings where people say, if people have to get a permit to withdraw water from the river, we might as well give all our property to the communists. And so, the problem for endangered species in Alabama is that our state agencies are starved for resources and dramatically understaffed, and so they're not going to be able to take up the weight. And then when we have Fish and Wildlife that's also understaffed and starved for resources, I think you'll get a big differentiation across states because you'll have states that do put the money into their Department of Conservation and Natural Resources or whatever they call it, and then states that don't, right? And so you have states that'll pick up the slack that Fish and Wildlife can't pick up, and you'll have states that don't.
Nobody else has any questions. I thought of a couple. So I was curious if you had any thoughts on how celebrity animals, like I think of Grizzly 399, how do celebrity bears like that impact public perceptions of the ESA and protections for wildlife?
Well, you're going to have to read Sam Kalin's article on that topic. But, it's the anthropomorphism of animals. And, that had some real consequences this summer for grizzly bears around Coulter Bay. The impact of people wanting to see, not 399, but one of her offsprings and one of her cubs, led to mom being separated from her cubs and then a big boar coming and depredating on one of those cubs. And so, there's real impacts from that kind of celebrity status. I don't specifically have any information to answer your actual question, which is how does it affect people's perceptions of the Endangered Species Act? But I would imagine it just sort of plays into the shadow narrative about, people's perceptions, whether they're real or not, about what the ESA is and how it affects bears like Bear 399.
Well, it also seems to be sort of the charismatic megafauna to the exponent of whatever number you want to pick, right? Like it's not just, there are adorable pandas and gorgeous tigers, but there's this bear that we're watching and we just desperately want to see her succeed, but that's just my thought.
Another online question we have. Do you see in your research, have you seen instances in which localities are getting overruled by distant metropolises when it comes to reintroduction or wildlife management? And could you provide any examples if you can think of any?
Yeah, well, for me, the Colorado gray wolf example is sort of topic number one, and I wish Kelly was here because she actually lives in Kremlin, Colorado, and is really in the front line of that issue. But that I think really is a great example for that question. Again, just that voter divide and that front range versus rural Colorado divide.
I think in Alabama, we face kind of the opposite problem, which is that there are localities that would like to do more to protect, for example, our riverine resources, but are overruled by the legislature of Alabama saying, no, you can't take those regulatory actions. And so it can work sort of both ways,
Kind of relating to that, it's kind of specifically for Temple, but you just talked a lot about the Colorado reintroduction and of gray wolves. What is the argument in favor of reintroducing these animals, especially when ecosystems have kind of moved on in their absence and adapted?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. Do ecosystems move on and adapt? Colorado, you're asking me to sort of play the devil's advocate. Colorado has a lot of elk, and that was a situation in Yellowstone before wolves were reintroduced. As elk were so abundant, they were really sort of eating themselves out of house and home. And so, I think maybe people who were advocates for a wolf reintroduction in Colorado wanted to see sort of the ability for the ecosystem to kind of restore back to a natural balance where you had natural predators on the landscape. I think that's part of it, but I also think there's just this human desire to see, a full ecosystem with predators included.
What that brings to mind for me is Alda Leopold, who's cited in Open Season, who in one of his early jobs was managing a forest in, I think, New Mexico, it might have been Arizona, and he wanted to improve the conditions for hunters, and he thought the best way to do that would be to kill all the wolves. And so he did that. And then the deer became, or the prey animals became sick and overpopulated and were not good for hunters. And he sort of said, wait a minute, I just messed with the whole system. And that sort of ultimately brought him to his view of the land ethic. And so I think there is an argument for, I mean, I don't know that ecosystems have moved on, right? I mean, I think we do a lot of artificial intervention to prevent, for example, overpopulation of deer in Alabama, because we don't have wolves in Alabama and the original predators. And if you don't, authorize more hunting permits in a particular season so that the deer population pops up 30%, they're all sick by the next year.
I know I might get some tomatoes thrown at me for this, or Friedenthal might corner me out in the hall for saying this, but there's been a couple of interesting studies that are released about the positive implications of wolves on the landscape in ways that I wouldn't have connected. But there's been some work out of some economists at the University of Wisconsin that talk about vehicle collisions with ungulates go down when wolves are on the landscape because they keep the wolves moving and off the highway. And then another one is that actually depredation of young livestock decreases when wolves are introduced. That sounds really weird. I know. I was like, I don't believe that. But when wolves are reintroduced, they keep the coyotes in check and the foxes in check. And it's those mesocarnivores that are actually doing a lot of the depredation events on the younger animals, the newly born calves and sheep. And a wolf will take a bigger animal. I mean, I'm sure they would take a young if they could. But they actually keep those mesopredators in check such that there actually is an overall lowering of depredation, which I know is hard to believe, but I've seen the paper and the data. So just something to just think about that, I know we've talked about the political concerns and the real risk of these predators in areas they haven't been for a long time, but there are some benefits.
All right, we just have a couple minutes left. I have one final great question. I was wondering if you could share your origin story and how you got involved in researching and studying this area of the law.
Well, I grew up spending a lot of time outdoors and always was, apparently I wrote a letter to Gerald Ford in 1974 asking him to save animals. And so it's been something I've been interested in for a long time. And then I sort of got more into the water side of things because I was lucky enough to take water resources law with Joe Sachs at Berkeley when I was a law student, which made the water resources side of things more my focus.
Great. For me, my father is a professor at Kansas State University in outdoor recreation management, and so we would spend our summers visiting as interns at different national parks across the country, and so that's where I was interested in the subject of public lands, and you can't think about public lands without wildlife. So,
great. Well, thank you both for your time today. We really appreciate your insight.